Yeah, it does work.
Okay, so this video was supposed to be live on Instagram, but you know, I got restricted for a suspicious reason. But anyway, we're here to read about Marxism, and we'll start by reading the introduction and down to the Lenin, Marxism, and class struggle, because those are my two favorites. So anyway, introduction by David Walker. I hope it's able to see clearly through this way. The century of Marxism. The 20th century was the century of Marxism. Regimes claiming the name covered much of the globe: Afghanistan, Albania, Angola, Benin, Bulgaria, China, Congo, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau. I'll be butchering some names because this is my first read too. And Cape Verde, or Cape Verde, if it's English. Hungary, Cambodia, Laos, Mongolia, Mozambique, North Korea, Poland, Romania, Somalia, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Yemen, and Yugoslavia. All boasted Marxist governments for periods in the 20th century. Hundreds of political organizations and parties proclaimed themselves to be a Marxist or Marxist-inspired, including, to name but a few, the British Communist Party, the Communist Party of the United States of America, the South African Communist Party, International Workers of the World, the Fourth International, the Khmer Rouge, and Sendero Luminoso. The 20th century also saw Marx's original ideas inspire the creation of a lexicon of terms denoting Marxist ideological variants such as Bolshevism, Menshevism, Leninism, Stalinism, Trotskyism, Maoism, Castroism, Austro-Marxism, analytical Marxism, structural Marxism, and Marxist humanism. To note just some of the more prominent ones, in addition, the use of Marxist ideas extended well beyond the field of politics to not just the more predictable areas of sociology, economics, history, and philosophy, areas in which Marx himself wrote significant works, but also such diverse fields as psychology, anthropology, ecology, and geography, corresponding to the spread and development of Marx's idea. And influence there was a spectacular growth in the literature on Marxism, Marxist organizations, movements, and regimes, and Marxist perspectives on almost everything within the field of social science, natural science, and the arts. It is difficult to overestimate the impact of Marxism on the world in the 20th century. Arguably, it contributed more than any other political ideology to the shape of the political and intellectual landscape of the last century, with the possible exception of liberalism. Again, it's important to know that Marxism is not at all liberal in the sense of how you use the term colloquially and as it is then in the academic.
I hope this is better.
Marxism in the 19th century. Okay, I'm gonna be adjusting a little bit, maybe for a few bit until I find the correct way. The origins of Marxism are found, so, in the century before last. In the 19th century, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I swear I cannot read his name.
Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels.
Friedrich Engels. Okay, I will commit that to the memory. Friedrich Engels produced the body of works that were to provide the basis for the Marxist movement and ideology. In these writings, Marx outlined what became known as his theory of historical materialism, an approach to the study of history and society that focuses on the productive or economic spheres of society as the key to understanding the nature, development, and trajectory of the society as a whole. According to orthodox interpretations of Marx's theory, the manner of production in a society shapes the character of the political and legal institutions, the morality, and the prevailing ideas. Production in this reading of Marx model is basic to society, and changes in the way a society alter the nature of that society. For example, the change from manual labor and simple tool as the means of production to the use of machinery and steam power saw society transform from feudalism to capitalism. This in turn saw a change in the political and legal institution and the religious, moral, and social attitude of society. Hence, religion no longer insisted on the divine right of kings, and all the ideas of classical liberalism concerning liberty of the individual, freedom of conscience, freedom of contract, the free market, and competition came to dominate society as feudalism gave way to capitalism. Marx also gave a trenchant analysis. Trenchant. I've never heard that word before. Trenchant meaning vigorous or incisive in expression or style. Or in the archaic literature is a weapon or tool having a sharp edge. Trenchant, that is. Marx also gave a trenchant analysis of the society of his time. Capitalism, which he characterized in terms of commodity production, private ownership of the means of production, and the free market. Marx identified contradictory tendencies within capitalism that would inevitably lead to its collapse. The pursuit of profit that drove capitalism forward would also ultimately destroy it by making the rate of profit steadily decline over time, with economic crises recurring each time more acute until a catastrophic collapse brought the entire capitalist structure crushing down. At the same time as these underlying economic forces were at work, a struggle between rulers and ruled was taking place. Capitalists, the ruling class, and workers, the oppressed masses, were in constant conflict. Their interests irreconcilable. Ultimately, Marx expected the victory of the workers over the capitalists and of socialism over capitalism in a process of revolutionary change. Yes, Please note that down. In the course of and alongside the developments of his theory of historical materialism and his analysis of capitalism, Marx, in a profound but unsystematic way, developed distinctive conceptions and theories of the state, class, revolution, human nature, alienation, and ideology. He mounted penetrating critique of capitalism, classical economics, liberalism, anarchism, non-Marxian socialism, religion, and the thought of contemporary European philosophers, notably the Hegelian idealists. Yes, Hegel. This very brief and hence necessarily simplify account of the main thrust and themes of Marx's thought indicates something of the 19th century foundation of the 20th century Marxist ideological developments described and discussed in this book. Underdeveloped or outdated aspects of Marx's thought in particular attracted the attention of 20th century thinkers and activists inspired by Marx, which with topics such as imperialism, the third world, women's emancipation. Let me see if y'all can see it. Okay, good. And culture prompting great outpouring of theorizing and writing. But even the most central of Marx's ideas, such as historical materialism and class, have not been immune to the effects of 20th century Marxists to update them, revise them, and improve them. In the 19th century, both as an ideology and a political movement, Marxism was far from dominant or preeminent, and on the European stage, let alone globally. For example, the League of Communists, for which Marx and Engels had produced the Communist Manifesto, was a small group of German immigrants. I'm afraid I don't know how to read that word. I'm afraid I don't even know what that means.
Emigre.
Emigre. So what does it mean? Emigre. Okay, the Cambridge did nothing for me. Please explain to me what emigre mean. So what language is this? Is it English? Oh yes, emigre. One who has departed their native land, often as refugee. An immigrant who departs their native land to become an immigrant in another. So okay, I guess that's exactly what I thought at first. Okay, good. In any case, let's resume. Where were we? Immigrants living in London, which fell apart after 1850. When was the first time it said? Okay, I didn't say it. The manifesto itself made virtually no impact at all when it was published in 1848. As for the other political organization with which Marx is most closely associated, the first International Working Men Association, to give it its full name, only lasted from 1864 to 1876, that 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. Okay, that's like 12 years. I'm sorry, I can't do math. Even the simple math forced me to count. Anyway, and despite Marx's increasing influence within it, was never a Marxist organization as such. It contained a broad range of groups, including followers of Bakunin, Mazzini, Proudhon, I'm sorry, that was French phobic. Proudhon, I'm not sure how it's pronounced anyway, and Blanqui. and political perspectives ranging from Messinian nationalism to Anglo-French positivism, with varieties of anarchism, socialism, and even Freemasonry also stirred into the pot. The Paris Commune of 1871 drew the attention of a wider audience to Marx as a result of his strong defense of the commune. Its analysis. Oh my god, the stress syllables are making me cry. His strong defense of the commune in writings and speeches, he was identified by newspapers and commentators as a leading and dangerous radical, closely associated with the Paris Commune despite having had nothing to do with its instigation and organization. However, even after this publicity, Marx's death in 1883 passed all but unnoticed, except for a brief paragraph in The Times, only with the German Social Democratic Party adopting a Marxist outlook in 1891, and the steady growth of the largely Marxist Second International in the last decade of the 19th century did Marxism as an ideology and as a movement begin to gain significance. This reminds me of a saying that like you can kill the man but you can't kill his idea. But I'm afraid I'm too brain rot and just see that one Elon Musk and Pol Pot picture. I'm sorry. In the 19th century then, Marxism was a marginal ideology struggling for ascendancy within the radical organizations and currents of the time. A fledgling movement in the latter half of the 19th century. It took the German Social Democratic Party and, above all, the Bolsheviks in Russia to instigate the transformation of Marxism from a sect to a mass and ultimately a global movement in the 20th century. The death of Marxism? There's a question mark and I had to make it louder. Or higher pitch, not louder. Born in the 19th century, Marxism came of age in 20th, and according to some, the last century also saw its death. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was breached, marking the end of Marxist regime in East Germany. In the same year, this is gonna be hard.
Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Failure, The Birth and Death of Communism in the 20th century, 1989, was published, in which he argued that communism had failed and its demise was inevitable, seemingly fulfilling Brzezinski's prediction in 1991. The Marxist regime in the Soviet Union collapsed. Its communist empire in Europe already fallen. By the 1990s, the Afro-Marxist regime had largely fallen or capitulated to outside pressure to abandon their ideological commitment. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama published a book, The End of History and the Last Man. Okay, let me move. 1992, in which he argued that Marxism was defeated and that capitalism had triumphed over its ideological adversary. Fukuyama described Marxist doctrine as discredited and totally exhausted. In 1999, Andrew Gamble began a book on Marxism with a chapter titled Why Bother with Marxism, in which he wrote, Marxism is widely perceived to be in crisis, and many believe the crisis is terminal. Marxism, it is said, had a long run, and now its energies are spent and its usefulness is long past. It is time to return Marx to the 19th century, where he belongs. Gamble L. 1999, Chapter 1. Brother is a fucking killjoy. Hold up. This is so good. Hold up. Okay, I'm back. The death of Marxism thesis suggests that the story of Marxism has come to an end and that any lingering doubts about the futility and falsity of Marxism have now been dispelled. Marxist theory and practice had been discredited. Furthermore, Marx died well over 100 years ago, and he wrote the Communist Manifesto more than 150 years ago. The world of Marx was very different from the world of today, politically, economically, and socially. So there can be little of interest or relevance in Marxism now. The Communist Manifesto must be seen for what it is, simply a historical document, and any truth there may have been in Marx's idea no longer applies in the 21st century. Boo fucking who. Proponents of this death of Marxism argued, overlook several points. First, some claim Marxist government continued to exist, most notably at the time of writing, in China and Cuba. Also, Marxist parties and Marxist-inspired organizations have continued to be active into the 21st century. The Zapatistas in Mexico, I'm sorry if I read that wrong. In fact, I will search it for you. Zapatista. Mamma mia.
Zapatistas.
Zapatista. Okay. Zapatista in Mexico, to name but one significant example of a group with Marxist influences. In addition, in a number of former communist countries, there is anecdotal electoral and opinion poll evidence of a growing nostalgia for the good old days of communism and of significant support for communist parties and policies. There's a number here, but I cannot see the footnote where it is. Second, Marxism is a living tradition that has changed and spread in different directions, so that although 19th and even 20th century Marxism may be dated just as 19th and 20th century, liberalism is. 21st century Marxism is not so easily dismissed as irrelevant. Third, the influence of Marx's ideas in a vast range of fields should not be underestimated, and the impact of Marxism, even in areas seemingly some distance from politics, areas such as geography and the arts, has already been noted. Finally, there is the issue of the discrediting of Marxism by reference to the practice of communist regimes. That is to say, Those pronouncing the death of Marxism argue that the failings and ultimate fall of the Soviet Union through the falsification of Marxism. At the very least, proponents of this will need to show that Marxist theory entails the practice seen in the Soviet Union, and also that the failings and collapses of the Soviet Union were due to its Marxism and not the other factors. Someone cooked here. However, it is fair to say that contemporary Marxists, in one sense at least, face a greater challenge than that faced by their predecessors, for now they are confronted with either defending or explaining the deed done in the name of Marxism, the great terror of Stalin's purge, the brutality of Mao's cultural revolution, and the killing field of Pol Pot. Now, also the absence of a successful and sustained Marxist revolution and the persistence of capitalism must be accounted for. Okay, now we're going to more juicier stuff. I say juicier stuff, but there's really nothing juicy here. Let me see. Beautiful. Can you see it? Yeah, I think so. Marxism, a 21st century perspective. The beginning of 21st century is an appropriate time to make an audit of Marxism, and in particular to reveal the ideas and theories that have built on Marx's thought in the course of the 20th century. In looking at the variety of schools of Marxism, it is implicitly accepted that Marxism is no monolith. There is an irreducible plurality of Marxism. This book is not an attempt to identify an authentic Marxist tradition, but rather it is a bit to explain and assess the range of important strands of Marxist thought that emerged in the 20th century. The only Marx thing I kind of remember is left communist and Leninist, what do you call it? Leninist, Marxist, ML, actually not RM. Matcha latte, la boo. La boo boo. La boo la boo, la boo boo. Where are we? Although representing a range of viewpoints and being far from uncritical of Marxism, the contributors to this book share a sense that Marxism as a body of thought and a political movement is profound and important. In general, there is a sense that far from having died, Marxism is alive and at least tolerably well. At the very least, it contains ideas and insights worthy of consideration. The failures of communism and the flaws in Marxist theorizing should not mask the fact that Marxist thought still has something to offer to contemporary politics and scholarships, and is likely to remain an important political and intellectual reference point well into the century also. In this century also, Marxism remained a developing tradition, and what the various authors show in writing about the different Marxisms that has been criticized for being dogmatic. Okay, I keep skipping line. Let me try again. In writing about the different Marxisms that have emerged, the Marxism is tremendously adaptable. For an ideology that has been criticized for being dogmatic, it is remarkable how flexible and varied it has proved to be. As early as 1899, it was revised by Edward Bernstein. It was then Russified in Russia, signified in China and adapted to local conditions wherever it spread by Che Guevara and Jose Carlo. Oh my god, I'm gonna mispronounce the name. Jose Carlo Mariátegui. Mariátegui. I cannot do this. In Latin America, by Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh in Asia, and by Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon in Africa, to highlight but a few examples. This range and variability of Marxisms is reflected in the book, and it is an important feature of this work that a truly global picture of Marxist thought is presented, avoiding the tendency in much literature on Marxism published in the English-speaking world to be too Eurocentric or Americocentric, or basically Yankee. The structure of the book falls into 3 parts, mixing chronological, geographical, and thematic approaches. Part 1 deals with the early Marxism and looks specifically at Lenin and Leninism, the right-wing Marxism of the Menshevik. The right-wing Marxism of the Menshevik, Karl Kautsky, and Edward Bernstein, the left-wing Marxism of Leon Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg. Choose your goat. Chapter 1 provides a robust defense of Lenin and Leninism by Alain Chandro, who argues that criticism of Lenin had been based on misreading and misunderstandings of him, failing to take into account the context in which he wrote his various work. The collapse of Soviet communism had meant a a special theory argument ignoring neat and comprehensive only be ignoring the true complexity of an issue. Superficial. Facile, that is. Let me redo it. Failing to take account the context in which he wrote his various works, the collapse of Soviet communism has meant a facile dismissal of Leninism and the reduction of Lenin to little more than a caricature, with a serious consideration of his ideas being avoided. Focusing particularly on 3 of Lenin's major works, his What is to be Done, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and State and Revolution, Chandro seeks to give Lenin's ideas the serious consideration they deserve. He defends Lenin's idea on spontaneity and the vanguard party on imperialism and on constitutional order and democratic rights. He rejects the criticism that what is to be done lays the theoretical foundation for the subordination of workers to an intellectual elite, arguing instead that Lenin was committed to dialectical interplay between the masses and the leadership, and that his will on the need for vanguard party have been considered in the context of the absence of proletarian hegemony. Chandro also asserts the continued reverence of Lenin's will on imperialism, suggesting that the logic of Lenin's argument requires political stance open to criticism. Throughout, Chandro emphasized Lenin's insistence that concrete situations be analyzed concretely. Far from suffering from the sins of intellectual pride, as his critics suggest, Lenin did not lay claim to absolute knowledge or philosophy of certainty. He was not dogmatic, but saw the fluidity of reality as necessitating constant re-examination of circumstance and the assumption governing his analysis. Ian Thatcher provides a historical comparison of Trotsky and Luxemburg left communism as a whole. He characterized as revolutionary, libertarian, socialist, anti-Stalinist, and anti-parliamentarian. Luxemburg he finds more libertarian than Trotsky, and ultimately more patient and principled, believing principles without power to be better than power without principles. In particular, Luxemburg will not sacrifice her commitment to democracy in order to achieve socialism, and constantly opposed the substitution of a vanguard party for the full involvement of the masses in revolution. Trotsky, on the other hand, while having a more lasting influence within Marxism, and despite his writings being of great importance to the project of constructing a non-Stalinist Marxism, suffers from his closeness to Lenin. Thatcher suggests that Trotsky could never be truthful about how Stalin and Stalinism emerged from Lenin and Leninism. He was the third wheel of the Yahweh. Jules Townshend offered a qualified defense of right-wing Marxism, a school which he notes had been widely criticized and condemned from within the Marxist tradition. Cautious, unheroic, and history's loser, right-wing Marxists such as the Mensheviks, Kautsky, and Bernstein nevertheless make significant contributions to Marxism. For Townshend, right-wing Marxism, unlike other strands of Marxism, never lost sight of the crucial link between democracy and socialism, through which workers' self-emancipation was to be achieved. They also brought a realism to the Marxist project, attempting to adapt Marxism to a new condition and to respond to an impact of modernity. Bernstein in particular upheld the critical spirit of Marxism and opened up space for moral advocacy in his bold visions of Marxism. The 21st century may prove a little kinder to right-wing Marxist reputations than the 20th, suggests Townshend. The thinkers and debates considered in Part 2 are in the main chronologically after those discussed in Part 1, but Part 2 follows a more geographical structure. It contains chapters on Soviet and Eastern Bloc Marxism, Euro communism, Western Marxism, African Marxism, Asian Marxism, and Latin American Marxism. In his chapter on Soviet and Eastern Bloc Marxism, Marx Sandel focuses on the development, consolidation, crisis, and eventual collapse of official Marxism. In the Soviet bloc, he notes that as an official belief system, Soviet Marxism-Lenin, the Soviet bloc, he noted that as an official, Soviet Marxism-Leninism held a monopoly position with all divergent views censored, cut off from all criticism and meaningful debate. Intellectual ossification was inevitable. Soviet Marxism, because of the dominant political position of the Soviet Union, was enormously influential, but because it became a dogmatic stylized set of empty formulas bearing no relation to reality, and was little more than a thinly veiled rationalization of the monopoly of the power of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It failed to indeed pass the collapse of the Soviet system in 1991. But this is not the whole story, according to Sandel. There were innovations in such areas as ethics, logic, and philosophy of history. And there were developments of Marxist theory of the transition from capitalism to communism and the nature of the transitional socialist and in communist societies. In addition, the contributions in the post-Stalin era, particularly in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, most notably the Praxis School, should not be overlooked. I don't think I read any of that word correctly. The path of Euro-communism is traced by Rick Simon, who notes its attempt to find a third way between Soviet-style communism and Western European social democracy, characterized by from up here. Simon characterized Euro-communism in terms of its critical stance towards Soviet Marxism, an emphasis on different national roads to socialism, an acceptance of the need for democracy and human and civil rights, and a commitment to using liberal democratic institutions to achieve socialism. He criticizes the failure of Euro-communists to generate an enduring theoretical framework, suggesting this was a product of their overemphasis on strategy, alliance, and national peculiarities. The very term Euro-communism implied a coherent identity that was apparent rather than real. And Euro-communism is essentially a phenomenon representing a phase in the crisis of the world communism. Simon concludes, ultimately, socialism can only be constructed on a global scale. By emphasizing national distinctiveness to the detriment of the global dimension, Euro-communism could only follow a reformist path through In a wild range chapter covering such heavyweight thinkers as George Lucas, Karl Korsch, Antonio Gramsci, Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Jean-Paul Sartre. I don't think his name is that grand. I just like saying like that. Jean-Paul Sartre and Louis Althusser is not and Louis Althusser. Joseph Lemire adopts a largely critical approach to Western Marxism. Lemire acknowledges the achievements of Western Marxism as a varied body of theory, particularly in its critique of scientific philosophy and positivist social science. However, Lemire questions the coherence of Western Marxist thought, arguing that the attempts of its exponent to introduce non-Marxist elements into Marxism amounted to an implicit critique of the Marx project, and hence we should not be surprised to see the trajectory of Western Marxists such as Habermas from Marxism to post-Marxism. In a damning conclusions, he writes, If the point of revolutionary theory is to change the world, then Western Marxism must be judged a failure. Holy shit, they're going hard on everyone here. Daryl Glaser, in his account and analysis of African Marxism, begins by looking at African socialism and its links and overlaps with African Marxism. He moves on to provide an informative exposition of Marxist theory on Africa and of the development of Marxism in Africa countries. Ironically, one key means of transmission being imperialism. The diversity of form of Marxism is highlighted, reflecting the very different conditions operating in different African countries, most notably the developed capitalist and feudal class system found in South Africa and Ethiopia respectively. Glaser argues that while a standard formula based on Leninist and Soviet teaching was applied by African Marxist government, there were also some distinctive contributions made by African Marxist movement and regimes. For example, General Mohammed Siad Barre's synthesis of Marxism and Islam, Ben Bell Arabo-Islamic Socialism, and Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and Dinkley People's Liberation Tigray. I can't fucking
Tigray.
Okay, Tigray. Where was I? Tigray People Liberation Front's view on succession. Sekotor experiments with mass party forms, and the Madagascar Marxist partial electoral pluralism. In discussing the decline and fall of Afro-Marxism, Glaser notes the relatively brief lifespan of most of Marxist regime in Africa from the 1970 to 1990, which had led to overwhelming majority of both participants and observers to judge the Marxist project in Africa as a failure. Glaser notes the difficulty in diagnosing this failure, given that it's not easy to separate out the effect of Marxism inadequacies and of Africa's malaise. I don't know that word.
Tigray.
Shit. Okay, why can't I spell? Malaise. A general feeling of discomfort, illness, or uneasiness whose exact cause is difficult to identify.
Malaise.
And of Africa's malaise. Nevertheless, Glaser identifies such problems as resource scarcity, hostile countries surrounding the Marxist regimes, overambition, impatience, and political ineptness on the part of their leader, and above all, the limitation of their Leninist-style democratic theory and practice as key factors in the failure of Afro-Marxism. For Glaser, the shortcomings of Afro-Marxism do not mean that Africa must embrace neoliberal capitalism or that Marxism has no place in the future of the continent. In the socialist projects of generating sustainable economic growth, deepening democracy, and limiting social inequality, it may yet be necessary to consult Marxism, if not to devise a new political order, then at least to provide a clear-sighted analysis of the new pattern of the class inequality that has formed on the ruins of discarded socialism. So far reading, almost everyone is either too Leninist or they just aren't Leninist enough. I need more of this grape. Grape. How many pages left? Oh, we can finish this soon. Nick Knight writes, "It is not the great ironies in the history of the Marxist tradition that Marxism has had a greater political impact in Asia than any other region of the globe. He lists Russia, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, and the Philippines are countries that have had Marxist government or important Marxist movement. Although Marx was a quintessentially European intellectual, his thoughts contain universal elements. Most importantly, a method based on material perspective focusing on production and critique of capitalism, a system that has spread to every pocket of the world. These universal elements appeal to Asian Marxists. Marx's specific writing on Asia have largely been ignored by Asian Marxists who have preferred to draw inspiration from Lenin's work that suggested that national anti-colonial revolution were key parts of the struggle for world revolution. Knight focuses on the thoughts of Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh as the most significant Asian Marxists. He notes how they both sought to adapt Marxism to local conditions and combine nationalism or patriotism with Marxism. Ultimately, Mao and Ho, you're gonna just call him Ho? Sorry. Ultimately, Mao and Ho were successful revolutionaries, but rather less successful in building socialism. And this points to Knight's overall assessment of the impacts of Marxism on Asia. Marxism worked as theory of revolution, but not as of socialist construction. It is noteworthy that since the death of Mao and Ho, both China and Vietnam has pursued policy more accommodating to capitalism. So I guess what I could infer from this is that we are more focused on revolution instead of trying to maintain the said revolution, I suppose so. And yeah, shit becoming more liberal each day. Not liberal, I mean more capitalistic. Slipped up, Freudian slip, or maybe not, I don't know. Where the hell am I? There are some parallel in Marx's views on Latin America and his views on Asia. In both instances, he displays an extremely Eurocentric viewpoint, and this is brought out strongly by Ronaldo Monk in his chapter. To give one quotation from Marx highlighted by Monk, we have witnessed the conquest of Mexico and have rejoiced at it. It is to the interest of its own development that Mexico will in future be placed under the tutelage of the United States. Monk provides an account of the contributions of thinkers probably less well known in Europe, including Juan Justo and Jose Carlos Mariátegui, both of whom attempt to Latin Americanize Marxism, with the latter becoming known as the continent's Gramsci. He also discusses Cuba, the Sandinista in Nicaragua, the Renovadore in Chile, and the Zapatista in Mexico, suggesting that Latin American Marxism is consumed in the developed countries as a series of icons. Think of Che Guevara, a little more than a poster image. Monks argue that its intellectual contribution is overlooked, in particular the theory of radical democracy, the national popular, and dependency theory have all been developed within the Latin American Marxist tradition. Looking to the future, Monk noticed the possibilities for the creative developments of Marxism freed up by the collapse of Soviet communism, but remains skeptical about the value of Marxism as a guide to action in Latin America. Amazing. The contributors in part 3 endeavored to engage with recent issues. That sounds like recent
Okay. Endeavor to engage with recent issues and debates in Marxist thought. Howard Chodos discusses the relationship between Marxism as theory and Marxist-inspired practice, and picking up on related themes. Daryl Glaser reflects on the theory and practice of Marxism, and in particular issue of epistemology and democratic procedure. Yaya Madra and Fikret Adamian stress economics more in their consideration of Marxist analysis of capitalism, and Daniel Little looks at the key areas of Marxism and method and the extent to which Marxism has something methodologically distinctive and useful to offer. In looking at the experience of attempts to put the Marxist vision of socialism into practice, Shodo notes the failure of historical communism to survive the 20th century intact. Either it collapsed, as in the case of Soviet Union, or it was drastically changed, almost out of recognition, as in the case of China. He also noted the economic failings and widespread human rights violations of communist regimes, while also acknowledging that there is no straightforward relationship between theory and practice. Shodo suggests that the historical record can legitimately be said to call into question the validity of Marxist project itself. Focused on the Soviet Union, Shodo examines the record of historical communism and draws up the historical balance sheet. The massive loss of life, both intended and unintended, the economic waste and inefficiency, and the environment devastation all lead Shodos to conclude that the Soviet experiment constitutes a massive failure. And whose style is that? Okay, seriously though. It's like what time is it? It's like 1 a.m. I'm reading this shit. Why? I have a debate class tomorrow at like 9 or 10. Yeah. Probing further into the nature of historical communism and its link with Marxist theory, Shodos developed his own characterization of historical communist regimes, identified the roles of the party and the fusions of the economics and social sphere as key in creating the structure of social accumulation of communist regimes. The link between the practice of historical communism and Marxist theory, and Shodos thus claim a link, lies in the combination of specific elements of Marxist theory. For Shodos, it is a Marxist teleology, a belief in the scientific character of Marxism, and a Manichean view of both the world and historical struggle, or allied to the concentration of enormous political and economical power in the hands of the ruling elite, yeah, both could be said, elite, that led to the disastrous record of historical communism. I'm low-key losing my mind right now. However, according to Shodos, the fate of historical communism is not inevitable, and its defense can be avoided by taking certain steps. First, Marxist regimes must not allow what he terms refeudalization, that is, the fusion of economy and polity, to take the place. Second, there must be genuine democracy with real political competition, multiple parties, and free expression. Third, the socialist project must end. Who the hell is this Shodo dude? Third, the socialist project must, in principle, be reversible through democratic means. The legitimacy of socialism depends on it, being freely chosen, and the people must be allowed the option of rejecting it. Fourth, human rights and freedom must be inviolable. Fifth, whereas the core dynamic of capitalism must be changed, not everything capitalist has to be altered. Finally, and perhaps from a Marxist perspective, most controversially of all, socialism must no longer be defined in the term of the rule of the working class. Okay, as Chodo concludes, if there is to be a future for Marxist-inspired socialism, a way must be found to initiate the transition to classlessness without the intermediate phase of working class power. I don't know how to feel about it. Glasser in his chapter focused on the meta-theoretical background of Marxist theory and action rather than on the content of viable Marxist theory, methodology, analysis, or program. He notes the poor economic performance, the democratic deficit, and the appalling human rights record of Marxist states, an overall history that should concern adherence to an ideology that stressed the link between theory and practice. After rejecting the view that it is Marxism's self-proclaimed scientific approach and epistemology that is the root of the totalitarianism displayed by Marxist states, Glasser puts forward two rules of Marxist translating Marxist theory into practice. First, knowledge must be viewed as provisional. Second, binding decisions must be constant based in order to avoid the failing, but rather is of benefits in the future. Marxists must be committed to the tenets that all knowledge is provisional and democratic procedures must be followed. In acknowledging that knowledge is provisional, Marxists must accept that there is no warrant to force people to be free. What is being forced upon people may turn out to be mistaken. In committing the procedural democracy, Marxists achieve legitimacy and give expression to the provisionality of knowledge rule. Glasser goes on to discuss the three roles of Marxism as interpreter, political, and legislator, role that again show the need for Marxists to be procedural democrats. For Glasser, Marxism must follow democracy-friendly rule and conduct and can contribute to democracy construction and other socially desired projects. A socialist radicalism coupled with principle proceduralism points to a 21st century Marxism. Okay. In looking at Marxist economics and analysis of capitalism, Madra and Adaman stress that there is no one homogeneous critique of political economy, but instead there is a multiplicity of Marxist theory that focus on two of the principal Marxist approaches or projects, each with very different implication: capital accumulation theories and class exploitation theory. Whereas the former project is committed to the analysis of capitalism as a crisis-ridden process of wealth accumulation, the latter can be described as the institutionally specific analysis of different class structure: capitalist, feudal, slave, independent, or communal, and their articulation. Wright, Mandra, and Adaman. In addition to discussing these two approaches, They provide an introduction to basic concepts of Marxist economics and a discussion of colonialism and imperialism from the viewpoint of Marxist economics. Madra and Adaman emphasize the political implication of different Marxist theory of capitalism, arguing that the way in which we theorize the economy affect the way in which we devise political strategy of social transformation. Accumulationist theory points to the state and capitalist cooperation as key location for struggle, whereas class exploitation theory directs attention to the multiplicity of forms of exploitation and domination within contemporary social formation, and also suggests possibility of imagining and enacting communal and maybe even independent class structures and democratic forms of governance today, as opposed to waiting for the terminal collapse of capitalism. A key insight suggests is that the economy, whether the world as a whole or of a specific country or region, even in the age of capitalism, is not wholly capitalist. Non-capitalism exists in the parts of the third world, but also in the informal sector, household, and some local communities where local public goods are provided by communal labor. For Madra and Adaman, the richness, relevance, and possibilities for further development are the most salient feature of Marxist economic theory. The class exploitation approach in particular has opened up new avenue for constructive political action, which, when combined with the insight of the more orthodox Marxist accumulationist approach, give a Marxist economy for the 21st century. Wow. In the final chapter of the book, little look at the contributions to social scientific methodology of both Marx and later Marxists. Oh my god, I didn't know the book was out there. Summarizing Marx's influence on the 20th century social science, little usefully provide list of theme and substantive methodological maxims for social research that constitute Marx's contribution. These include emphasizing and focusing on class productions, technology, property, alienation, and exploitation. Overall, little see Marx as offering not a tight prescriptive body of methodological tenets, but rather a loose set of prescriptions, a heuristic that directs us to be flexible in applying materialism to look at what? At material institution, class, power, exploitation, and domination, to be aware of the material institution, class, wait, I just read that. To be aware of contradictions in social formation and to seek underlying causes and structures. In short, Marx provides a loose research program inspired by a congeries of hypotheses, insights, and salient, powerful interpretation. For little, this style, rather than method of inquiry, is eclectic and plural and still has much to offer. In the course of the book, contributors describe the record of Marxist thinkers and schools of thought in the 20th century and put forward criticism and defense of various aspects of Marxist thought. For some, such as Jamir and Monk, there is much to criticize and reject, whereas others, Sandroth and Townshend, for example, offer a more sympathetic account of Marxism, or at least of aspect of it. This critical survey lead into discussion of aspect to recent Marxist theory, where the contemporary relevance of Marxism is most directly breached. Schoedel, Glaser, Madra, and Edelman and Little all point to a role for Marxism in the 21st century, mindful of its history, failing, and lacunae. I never see that word before. What is that? Lacunae? Lacuna. An unfilled space or interval, a gap, cavity. Failings and lacuna, they all suggest direction for development and way in which Marxist theory might still prove fruitful. The century of Marxism has not quite given way to century of post-Marxism. I am reading all that.